Hi, John.
Hey, Will.
How you doing today?
Doing very well. How are you?
I'm doing extremely well. Thanks for coming on.
My pleasure.
I am Will Wilkinson at the Cato Institute. I have with me today Jonathan Haidt at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. How's Charlottesville, John?
Charlottesville is a beautiful place year-round, except for July and August, so it is very beautiful right now.
But next month it'll get a little more.
It'll hit, yes.
Yeah. For a number of years when I worked for the Institute for Humane Studies, I ran a seminar at UVA, and usually at the end of June, and sometimes we would get waylaid by muggy Charlottesville weather, so it can be unpleasant, but it is a beautiful little town.
Yes, very similar weather to Washington, except without all the hot air.
That's right. So, John, first of all, let's talk a little bit about your work, and I think there's now a developing series here on free will about sort of the natural foundations of morality. So last week we had Sean Nichols on.
Very good.
And talking about his book. I should mention that John is the author of a recent book, which I don't have a copy in front of me, called The Happiness Hypothesis. What's the subtitle? Finding
Modern Truth in Ancient Wisdom.
Yeah. And that is one of my favorite happiness books, John.
Well, you should know. It looks like you've read them all recently.
I've read them. I've read them all recently.
My condolences.
And exactly. But your book, I found to be the most, I guess, the deepest. I found it to have the most insight among there's a lot of books on happiness that have, just kind of cover. Here's a bunch of survey results. Here's a bunch of regressions.
Right.
But you have a well worked out set of psychological theories that sort of underpin this stuff.
Well, thanks. The reason why mine is so different is because it wasn't really a book on happiness. The original title was 10 Great Truths, Insights into Mind and Heart from Ancient Cultures and Modern Psychology, and it grew out of my teaching Psych 101 and noticing that a lot of the psychological principles I was telling my students about were best captured in quotes from Buddha or Marcus Aurelius or many other people. And I decided to write a book looking at what are the greatest psychological insights of all time. So the original title was 12 Great Truths, and then I was running out of time, so it became 10 Great Truths. And then when I turned the manuscript in, the publishers said, oh, well, everyone wants to know about happiness. Let's call it the Happiness Hypothesis. And I couldn't come up with a much better title, so that's the way they went. But
what were the two truths that got left out?
Well, a couple got merged in. There was one on work. And it turned out the ancients actually didn't have that much to say about work, so I just sort of merged that into the last chapter. And
you kind of don't. You want a slave to do it for you, kind of.
Yeah, that's right. There wasn't a lot on the joys of work back when they were building the pyramids or something like that. And I guess a lot of what we're going to talk about today, I hope, will grow out of things that I came to think about politics and religion while writing that book.
Yeah. Well, let's get into some of the nitty gritty of some of that. So, John, you're one of the leaders in, I guess the field is moral psychology, I guess call it.
That's the field, yes.
So there's a bunch of psychologists and philosophers with a bit of an empirical bent have been sort of researching the foundations of, our moral sentiments, our moral judgment, why it is that we are sort of guided by moral rules at all. And so let's try to set the stage a little bit by talking about maybe a little bit of the history of this and the competition between more intellectualist views and more sort of intuitionist or emotivist views. So can you tell us a little bit about the competition between the idea that morality is really based in cognition and the view that's based in emotion?
Sure. Well, I think we should back up and look at the long history of thinking about morality. It's one of the oldest topics of human inquiry and writing. So as soon as you get ancient texts, if you look at the Code of Hammurabi or the Hindu Vedas or the Old Testament, they're very heavily about morality, and law and regulating other people's behavior and judging it. Many of these early authors and many current ones have noted that the animals don't have morality, but we do. So where did it come from? And children don't have morality, but older babies don't, toddlers don't, but older children do. So where did it come from? And almost everybody has assumed, well, it has to come from outside and get put in. And then the debate was just, did God put it in? Did the parent's superego put it in?
Yeah.
Did the child internalize it during the resolution of its Oedipal complex? Did the media put it in? Did kids just soak it in, which is what's called the standard social science model? All along, there have been some that thought that it was somehow innate, just a part of the human heart. But with Darwin, with the advent of Darwin, now it became possible to say how something could just be part of the original equipment. So I think that there was a kind of a move towards a new synthesis, a move towards an evolutionary synthesis begun by Edward O. Wilson in 1975 or 76. He was a little too early politically. That is, we academics are pretty much all liberals, and liberals were entirely devoted to social justice. And social justice somehow, for a long time, meant no determinism, because that could somehow be used to say that men are different from women, etc. So
people deserve their place in this sort of hierarchical structure.
Exactly, that's right, and that's a terrifying conclusion. So everything has to be everything has to be explained by the standard social science model. That model is one of the worst ideas ever to come out of psychology. I would summarize the history of psychology in the last 50 years as basically the progressive realization of just how wrong empiricism has been. That is, the doctrine that everything we know comes from experience. Twin studies, so many of the things show that our genes, our prenatal hormones shape our brains, and our brains shape everything else about us. So what I've been doing in the company of a number of other people, including Robert Wright, is to not just say, well, okay, morality evolved, or at least clearly parts of morality evolved. Morality is part of human nature, just as language and sexuality are, and they obviously evolved. So what I've been trying to do is say, okay, let's be specific here. There's so much work on altruism. There's so much work on reciprocal altruism and kin selection. Frankly, I'm sick of it. I'm bored of it. I can't stand to read another paragraph about it. And what I've been doing is looking around at different cultures. I spent some time in anthropology at the University of Chicago, did some work in India. And more recently, I've been looking at political subcultures, liberals and conservatives. And what I've been trying to do is map out what are all the different things that different cultures think are part of morality, and it's not the same set. It's not universal.
Well, that's awesome. I should mention, and we'll put a link up. You have a great piece last year that appeared in Science called "The New Synthesis of Moral Psychology."
Right.
And people can follow that link and get a slightly more in-depth interview or overview of.
That's right. In fact, if anyone can go to www.jonathanhaidt.com. It's my homepage. And actually, of course, this interview, being almost an hour long, is considerably more in-depth than a Science article is, but that's a very concise summary there of the state of the art, as I see it.
And a lot of footnotes you can follow if they're still in fun.
Right.
So thank you for that contextualization. That was awesome. So now tell us where your work then sort of like fits in this recent history of research into the useful origins of moral judgment.
Sure. So when I started graduate school in 1987, moral psychology pretty much meant Lawrence Kohlberg, Jean Piaget, and the study of development, of how children develop a sense of fairness and justice. And I read that work, and it just bored me. I mean, maybe I rely too much on my intuitions here. I now call myself an intuitionist. Maybe I'm unusual in this, but I just had a strong gut feeling this was it was missing the heart of it. I grew up with two sisters. We fought every day. Morality was very passionate. It was about gaining an advantage, making your case to mom. And the stuff I was reading about the child, with all this focus on justice and fairness, well, of course, that is a big part of sibling morality, but it seemed to be missing the heart of it. It seemed to be missing the passion. It seemed to be way too cerebral. So beginning in graduate school in the late 80s, I began to read a lot of work on the importance of emotions, on the way that moral judgments may depend on emotions. And I wrote a review paper published in 2001 that brought together all of this research, saying, let's look at other animals, let's look at children's development, let's look at psychopaths, let's look at all these phenomena about our moral lives, and let's decide, does this fit better with the idea that we figure out morality for ourselves and we construct it for ourselves from our experience? Or does this fit better with the idea that we're animals, a little different from other animals, but we're animals that have a strong, very much predefined sort of nature, which gets modified by our cultural experience. So I made the case that it is the latter, that is, that moral judgment is really a matter of gut feelings, and that our moral talk should not be taken so seriously. Thinking is for doing, moral judging is for doing, and what we're trying to do is prepare our case and make our case in the court of public opinion. So all these psychologists who were studying moral reasoning, giving kids moral dilemmas and saying, well, what do you think about this? Should Haidt steal a drug to save the life of his wife who's dying from cancer? And the kids talk and talk and talk. My early research and this literature review made the case that what happens instantly is a gut feeling. You just as when you're looking at a painting, moral judgment is like aesthetic judgment. You have a quick aesthetic reaction, and then you talk and talk and talk. We're very good at talking. We're very good at making stuff up.
Yeah. So the idea is that the gut feeling comes first, and then sort of the rationalization or the justification of the feeling comes second.
Exactly.
So you've got some very ingenious experiments that are actually quite entertaining as well, that help you establish that point. So tell us a little bit about how you figure that out.
So when I was in graduate school, everybody was giving these dilemmas about justice and fairness. But I began reading the Old Testament and the Hindu scriptures and a lot of religious works that were all about the body. There was so much more regulation of menstruation and food and death and hygiene. And I started wondering, well, what role does disgust play? Why is all this moral regulation? Why is it all about the body? So I tried to make up some moral dilemmas that involved the body, that involved disgust. So in my dissertation, my first really major research project was a cross-cultural study done in Brazil and the U.S. and across social classes. I gave people stories about, for example, a family, their dog is killed by a car in front of their house. They heard that dog meat was delicious, and so they cut up the dog's body and they cooked it and ate it for dinner. What do you think about this? Was this okay for them to do that, or was it wrong? And what I found is that in almost every group I looked at in Brazil and the U.S., people said this was wrong.
Ew.
Why is it wrong? Well, it's disgusting. It's family. You don't eat family. The only group I found that said this was okay
Fluffy.
was the college students at the University of Pennsylvania, that is the high social class, educated, generally very liberal group, who basically said, well, it's disgusting, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. They have a right to do what they want. It's their dog, and some of them even said, and besides, it's recycling, which makes it efficient.
Yeah.
So this was my first hint that the moral domain varies across cultures. Among the college students who share the culture that I was raised in, or the culture that I've been in for a long time, morality is about protecting individuals from harm, especially vulnerable individuals. That's pretty much it. So it's harm, rights, and justice. Whereas in all the other groups I talk to, especially less educated groups and non-Western groups, morality is about a lot of stuff. It's about the ideal structure of the family, very much. It's about loyalty, patriotism, respect for authority, purity, God, devotion, piety. So my early empirical work showed me that I was a member of an unusual subculture, and that my subculture was doing all the writing on morality. So we were describing our own morality, but we were leaving out that of most other people.
Yeah, well, that's always bugged me when I was when I was in graduate school. I was in moral philosophy as a graduate student, and you have a bunch of mostly upper middle class liberal kids talking to an upper middle class liberal professor, and we're all inspecting our intuitions about moral cases as if that's going to give us reliable information about the nature of morality generally.
That's right. It's a huge problem. It leads people to hear opinions around them that support what they believe, and it leads to an enormous sense of self-righteousness, this narrowing of the moral domain. I think this is going to be a big issue in the current election because Obama, even though I thought that he really got this broader morality, he can speak with religious cadences, so he seemed very promising at first, and I think he still will be, but he also is showing himself to be more of a standard liberal, concerned about just harm, rights, and justice, his comments about bitterness and clinging to guns and religion really missed the point and showed that he doesn't necessarily get the full broad morality. McCain is going to do great at that. McCain is going to speak to a much wider variety of moral issues, to people's longing to serve a cause larger than themselves, their sense that there's a need for social order, for self-sacrifice. So I think this election, I guess all elections are about morality, but this one's going to be the most interesting in a very long time.
Well, that's great. Let's come back to that in a minute. Let's put a little bit more of a sort of intellectual foundation under that distinction. So you've developed a theory of moral foundation. The idea is that there's that the moral sensibility. So our moral judgments aren't based primarily in cognition. They're based primarily in sentiment. But it's not one big sort of unitary moral emotion that occurs. There's a bunch of different moral emotions that are activated in different domains, and so you have a theory of the 5 different foundations.
That's right.
In our psychology, each of which has a unique evolutionary history. So it was supposed to serve a particular function in the history of the organism. And now, and one of the reasons why we see so much variety in morality across cultures is that each of these dimensions can be sort of calibrated in slightly different ways. So we get different combinations of moral sensibility. So on the one hand, morality is universal because each of these 5 moral foundations is innate, but people can vary along each one of these dimensions, or different cultures can vary along these dimensions, and so you see a lot of diversity within that unity. Is that a...
Yep, that's an extremely good summary. That's exactly right. That's very much the way I would have said it. There's a big problem in the sciences is that we think that scientific progress means explaining everything with one principle, a unified field theory, something like that. So when people set out to study morality, they want to find, say, the moral organ or the foundation of morality. And then there are big debates as to whether, well, is it ultimately all about harm and then utilitarianism becomes the most fitting moral system? Or is it all about rights and justice, in which case more deontological theories come into play? And this is what a lot of the academic debates have been about. Which one is it? And what I found, beginning with this research I mentioned across cultures and in India, is that morality is a big, complicated mess of human instinct. There's no reason to think that there's a moral organ or that evolution said, oh, we need to create morality. Rather, we've been social animals for millions and millions of years. We have a whole toolbox, a whole set of different patterns and programs and perceptual abilities. So I'll just go through the 5 that I believe are the foundations of human morality. The first is harm and care. Those grow out of our status as mammals. We're really good at caring for helpless children, and we have a whole attachment system. So this whole sort of morality of care this what you'll find in every culture. This is a universal foundation. The second foundation is fairness and reciprocity. You will not find a human culture that doesn't care an awful lot about reciprocity. What you did to me, what I do to you. You do me a favor, I do you a favor. And so those 2 foundations, the harm foundation, the fairness foundation, those you find everywhere. But where the theory gets interesting is that as soon as you step outside of our sort of narrow cosmopolitan subculture, you find that people care an awful lot about 3 other systems. So system number 3 is in-group and loyalty. And this is essential for collective action. It seems tribal. Liberals hate this because it's the foundation of in-group. The very word in-group is somehow equated with racism for liberals. So liberals don't see this as morality. This is what a lot of the misunderstanding is. Liberals just dismiss this as the foundation of racism. But loyalty to a group, our ability to form collective enterprises and to sacrifice for the group are crucial for the foundation of civilization, for any kind of team psychology, for military psychology, sports psychology, business psychology. And I think, and what I've basically found is that liberals limit liberal morality is based overwhelmingly on these first two foundations. Conservatives use all five. So because conservatives have a better sense of loyalty and groupishness, they're able to outcompete Democrats even when the numbers aren't in their favor. They hang together better. Yeah. It's a real liberal disease. Liberals are like herding cats.
So what are the last two? So
the last two. So number 4 is authority respect. And this you find its precursors in other primates. You see the displays of deference, bowing, putting your head to the ground. These sorts of things you find all over the world as displays of deference to legitimate authority. Clearly have our evolutionary heritage. We have this in common with chimpanzees and other animals.
Well, it's not just legitimate authority, too. It's just who's higher than you on the dominance deference hierarchy.
Well,
right?
That's true. Good point. That the roots of this are in dominance and submission, and that's not about legitimate authority. That's about raw power. Who can beat the hell out of who?
Yeah.
But with humans, we've changed it so that it's actually deference and respect. Usually is sincere. We really do respect people. We really do look up to people. I felt this a lot in India. There were men that I was interacting with who really carried themselves in an aristocratic way, in an authoritative way, and I liked them. I looked up to them, and I felt certain feelings that I either hadn't known before or hadn't had a label for before. When I came back to America after being in India, I discovered that conservatives, or at least religious conservatives, traditionalists, are doing this all the time. So it's a whole language of authority and respect that is, again, dismissed by liberals as somehow related to oppression. It's illegitimate. Authority is oppression for liberals. The last foundation, so system number 5, is about purity and sanctity. And this is the one that you find so explicitly in the Old Testament, in Hindu scriptures, in some Buddhist scriptures. This pervasive human idea that the way you manage your body has important consequences for your spiritual progress, for your ability to communicate with God. So this sounds like crazy, superstitious gobbledygook for secular liberals. But we do see traces of it in liberals' concerns about environmental purity, about toxins. People are into New Age beliefs and religions. They're always talking about toxins. And I ask them, well, what are these chemicals, or are they mystery radio waves or something? What are they?
Yeah. If you go to my yoga studio, which is right next to the Whole Foods.
Yep.
If you go out front and smoke a cigarette,
exactly.
it's not like it's just people like, oh, maybe that's imprudent.
Exactly.
That's not the reaction. It's you're defiling yourself.
That's it. That's the language.
It's you're poisoning yourself.
The body is a temple. This is what most people believe. It may not be so much an innate intuition as an innately prepared one. That is, we easily learn this. Our minds somehow find this very compatible. We kind of like thinking this way. So a lot of religions and New Age religions play upon this, and we love it. We soak it up. So you do find some purity beliefs on the left, although the religious right is deeply into it. If you read anything by Bin Laden or writing on Sharia, the idea of creating an ideal state in which temptations are people are helped to resist temptation, they're helped to live in the right way. This is a lot of Al-Qaeda's writings about the decadence of the West. It is about how we act like our bodies are playgrounds. We have sex whenever we want. We take drugs. We eat whatever nonsense, whatever horrible food tastes good to us. So this is a very pervasive idea, and one which does not figure in Western writing on morality, because it doesn't make sense.
Well, let's talk a little bit about how you would figure out that those are the 5 foundations, and that there isn't a 6th foundation, or that 2 of these foundations shouldn't be merged together. Real briefly for people who might have objections, because I know that, like in personality psychology, there's like a big 5 personality traits, and they've figured out that those are the 5 using certain kinds of statistical techniques that try to control for all these factors. And then
that's right. So it's very much the same way here. That's right. So it begins with a theoretical or literature review in which we say, what are the likely candidates? And then in my case, what I did was, in conjunction with Craig Joseph, a colleague of mine, we surveyed the evolutionary literature to at least improve the conceptual case of what what systems were likely to have had some functional significance. There were different sets of selection pressures. So that's how we came up with the theory originally. Then as for how we tested it, a graduate student here at UVA working with me, Jesse Graham, made up a scale. We made up a lot of questions to test these 5 different foundations. And we gave them to a lot of people, a couple thousand people, did factor analyses and correlation analyses. And what we find is it's not certain that these 5 are completely distinct. What we find is that the first 2 are heavily intercorrelated. That is, harm and fairness. Those are basically the liberal foundations. So if you actually, so to use the analogy that I got from you, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
The moral mind is like an audio equalizer. And if you imagine 5 slider switches, the first 2 are the harm and fairness foundations or switches. If you have a high setting on one, you tend to have a high setting on the other. But even there, we find that, for example, people who are active in PETA, I would predict, in animal rights, we're actually much more concerned about animal welfare, whereas people active in civil rights are going to be much more concerned about fairness, justice, equality. So we do find that these 2 come apart. The more conservative 3, that is in-group, authority, and purity, those 3 also tend to correlate pretty well with each other. So what we find is that there's clearly a first split where the harm and fairness go together and the in-group authority and purity go together. We then do additional, what's called a confirmatory factor analysis to check out whether it gains us anything to say that there's a further split into the 5 foundations, and there is. So that doesn't settle the matter. That just says that using the questions we've asked, we have support for there being 5 separations with some degree of distinctiveness among them. However, it's a big open question about lumping and splitting. In particular, the in-group and authority foundations, those questions tend to go together really well. So if somebody wants to say, well, there's not really 5, there's fewer, I'd say it could be that the in-group and authority, those systems co-evolved so much during our long tribal history, our history of tribalism. Then there's also the splitting possibility. Are there different kinds of fairness? Yes. Liberals and conservatives value different kinds of fairness. Well, should those be 2 different foundations? I don't think so, but people could make the case. Lastly, I'd say that counting up the number of foundations of human morality is like counting up the number of planets that orbit the sun. There's a lot of them out there. Now, are there a million? Well, if you count everything, then yeah, there's many millions. But if you only count the really big ones, how many are there? Well, it looks like 8, but what about Pluto? So I think that these 5 foundations are the best candidates. But there's a lot of other stuff. Some people have written in on the website where we carry out this debate. It'll be called in a moment, in a few days, it'll be called moralfoundationstheory.com. Or rather, moralfoundationstheory.org. People can write in and critique the theory. And some have proposed that there are intuitions about wastefulness, intuitions about authenticity, and I think that's right. I just think that those are probably going to be more like Pluto or the other outlying bodies that are not really planets.
So tell me, John, have you found anything distinctively about my tribe? So I'm here at the Cato Institute. We're a bunch of libertarians. And libertarians always sit uncomfortably within the conservative, liberal, dialogue in practical politics. Right. What is the sort of moral profile of a libertarian? Do you have any information on that?
We do. I think we have better information than most people because at our website, which is yourmorals.org, that's where we do our research. At our website, we don't just force people to say whether they're liberal or conservative on a 7-point scale, as most people do. We allow an option for people to say libertarian. And we have a few thousand libertarians who filled out the scale on the site, thanks to you in part. Thank you for writing about it. And what we find, if you look at that sort of snapshot, if you look at people's settings on this equalizer, this moral equalizer, what we find is that libertarians look pretty much like liberals. That is, libertarians, as the name suggests, believe in liberty. That is, they think you shouldn't be hurting people. You need some laws and rules, but beyond that, people should be free to do what they want. So libertarians aren't really much for joining, for in-group versus out-group, for hierarchy, for purity. They have very low settings on the 3 more conservative ones. So they look very much like liberals, although a little less concerned about harm. Liberals, I think, have a sort of a hyper-valuation of harm. Liberals are very good at finding victims, even among people who don't know that they're victims. Liberals are like conservatives in being a little less concerned about harm and fairness than liberals, but they're much more like liberals in being really much less concerned about in-group authority and purity. So I think what's happening here is that liberals, well, classically liberals were concerned about liberty, and libertarians are sort of the true classic liberals. Libertarians fit better with the morality of liberals. It's just that they don't like the economic policies and a lot of the sort of the heavy-handedness of liberal policies. As somebody, I think it might have been on your blog, I think it might have been you, said, libertarians are liberals who've read some economics. Was that you? Was that a line from you?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's right. I think that libertarians don't really belong in the Republican Party. But the Republican Party, beginning with Reagan and perhaps early, did a great job of appealing to them in terms of economic regulation and the size of government.
Yeah, well, I just wrote about this last week where on my blog and got quite a bit of discussion about where it is that libertarians belong, and sort of historically there was a sort of big anti-communist coalition between libertarians and conservatives. So some of the conservatives were afraid of communism, partly because it was godless,
right.
But
also and the collectivism
and the collectivism. America has a sort of unique individualist,
right.
Sort of do-it-yourself culture. So there was this sort of anti-socialist coalition between conservatives and libertarians, and I think some of that had kind of a trickle-down effect, where a lot of libertarians came to have conservative sympathies sort of opportunistically,
right.
or there's a big literature on sort of like motivated cognition and motivated.
Yes.
I think people can come to have views because it's useful, and I think a lot of libertarians adopted some more conservative views, partly because it helped coalesce this union with conservatives that really did effectively help block the sort of encroachment of socialism in the United States. But
That's
now,
right.
like the idea that socialism is actually
nobody talks about it anymore.
Yeah, nobody talks about it. I mean, and it's not like Sweden is becoming more like the United States, and the United States is becoming like Sweden. So it's not like the welfare state is going to slide us into economic planning anytime soon. So with the dissolution of with the sort of obsolescence of communism and socialism as a real alternative, the point of the libertarian-conservative alliance is kind of broken down, and I think a lot of libertarians are sort of searching for what their identity is, and I've been maintaining that really the people who seem strongly libertarian to me have liberal emotional intuitions.
That's right. That's absolutely right. I mean, they're they're much more kindred spirits to liberal Democrats than they are to the religious right, let's say. So I think the libertarian vote, can be huge. I read somewhere that even though a lot of people don't call themselves libertarian, if you ask them questions about their policy preferences, it ends up being a lot of people who are in sympathy. I think a couple of things happened that are really hurting the Democrats. We'll see if they can get out of it now. I think the Democrats really went wrong in the 60s when the New Left came in and kind of took over from the Old Left. The New Left was really about social justice. It was motivated by the very real horrors of legal discrimination. I'm shocked and embarrassed to say that when I was born in 1963, discrimination was legal in the state that I now live in Virginia. So I think because of that, the left, or rather, let's say the Democratic Party.
But it took even longer before you could. It's only like 30 years since you could have a mixed race marriage.
That's right. Loving versus Virginia. That was the case that decided the Supreme Court. So Virginia has a lot to make up for. I think we're doing a great job of it now, and UVA is doing a great job of it. But I think the Democratic Party is still stuck in many ways back in that struggle. I think at that time, that's when the Democrats became much more a party of social justice rather than a coalition. It's always been a coalition, but it's united by this social justice morality, and social justice is largely kind of offensive to most Americans. That is, the emphasis on equality of outcome is deeply un-American. In order to get equality of outcome, you have to use some heavy-handed techniques, deeply un-American. And I think that the Democrats and liberals in general have been really reluctant to embrace federalism, to embrace the idea that, the basic idea of our country was that states and localities should have the maximum leeway possible, that we should not have a heavy-handed federal government. That was the original idea. That federalism utterly failed to deal with segregation. It allowed segregation as it had allowed slavery before.
Yeah.
So I think for this reason, the Democrats and liberals in general rejected it and have gone much more to a model of federal solutions for every problem. And until they can get over that, until they can say, you know what, sometimes you do need a federal solution. There's no doubt there are some common dilemmas, some externalities. There are all sorts of reasons why you do need a federal response. But we should always look into lower-level responses first. If the Democrats could start talking in that way, that is, get over the righteousness of the 60s and the emphasis on federal solutions, I think they could win back a lot of libertarians. Until they do that, I think they can't.
Yeah. It's interesting. Precisely this issue is an issue where I have a lot of conflicts with my own domestic partner, Carrie Howley, where and I think we sort of like divide right along on this axis, where I think she's even more sort of radically liberal than I am, and she's a very strong libertarian because she believes very strongly in the sort of humanitarian consequences of relatively unregulated markets and relatively unregulated borders and things like that. But she's incredibly resistant to, and I've become more sympathetic to her view because she argues it so articulately. She's incredibly resistant to the idea of subsidiarity. A lot of conservatives like to say it's a conservative principle. The scope of governance ought to be the smallest possible unit. And it's a Catholic term, I think, but it's the sort of principle kind of behind federalism. So the smallest jurisdiction ought to have the legitimate authority to decide its own affairs insofar as it's efficient possible. Now, Kerry really strongly resists that because basically what you're saying is that people are going to be allowed to be a liberal, right? That people with their settings really strongly to sort of hierarchy or purity, that incredibly patriarchal families can favor their sons over their daughters. I see. They can. I mean, absolutely. This case in Texas with the polygamists is a great issue of that, where okay, so we've got a place where and I feel very strong. I feel actually quite mixed about it. Partly because my liberal sensibility says it's actually just a moral crime to be raising young girls in isolation from the rest of the world with the expectation that their only worth is to be married off to basically their uncle and have children as a teenager. So they're not even their fundamental capacities aren't developed to a level where they actually have any awareness of the relevant alternatives. So it actually seems to me that they don't really have a sort of a rich sort of autonomy. They're really not making a decision.
That's right. And the question is that a sacred value? Is autonomy a sacred value for which you are willing to sacrifice everything else?
Yeah,
and if you're a liberal, it is.
Yeah, and so that's the question. So where do you? Because there's always going to be a point when we're sort of calibrating, when we're deciding what's okay culturally, insofar as what people's settings can be on the sort of moral equalizer. This kind of setting, which is so insensitive to questions of harm and fairness, is that can we tolerate that? And part of me doesn't want to tolerate it at all. And so like I think that so I wouldn't have minded had the state of Texas been a little more fine-grained and actually identified individual harms and took individual children away from their individual parents.
That's right. Taking all that was horrible. To take the children away unless they were in mortal danger right away.
Right. Instead of this, but I very much sympathize with that idea behind it. And so there's this constant conflict, I think, between a liberal moral sensibility and the pluralism that is kind of encouraged by federalism.
That is our fate. That will always be the fate of this country. Is to be engaged in that struggle. How much freedom do we allow? How much subsidiarity? And when do we say no? You're hurting those kids. You're enslaving those women. That's the struggle. And the first step, until we do this, we are doomed to fail, to just get it entirely wrong. The first step is you have to understand what the other side is up to. You have to understand that their morality is not your morality. So that means saying,
but it
you know
is
what?
Amorality.
Exactly, it is. Now, so I'm not an apologist for anything that happens. I mean, it's not like any long-standing community is going to have a moral worldview that is probably coherent and is probably not so bad if you can understand it in its terms. Now, with that said, it's also the case that power corrupts. And when you have these men given license to marry as many young girls as they want and to justify it in terms of God's will, yeah, you're going to get oppression, you're going to get enslavement, you're going to get horrible things happening. So I'm not saying that, oh, well, they have a moral justification, so let's let them alone. But I am saying that if you want to play this game, if you want to start critiquing other groups, you've got to understand what morality is, how it works, and that there's wisdom on both sides. And this gets us back to the happiness hypothesis. The basic finding from reviewing all these ideas from other cultures is that there's a wisdom of conservatism, there's a wisdom of traditionalism, there was a wisdom of liberalism and progressivism. And if you take any one of these out and let it run entirely its own society, it's going to do all sorts of weird and destructive things. You need a balance between liberal impulses and conservative impulses. It doesn't mean that every place has to be homogeneously mixed. I think it's great that we have New York and San Francisco so that people who really don't fit into small-town America have a mecca to go to be incredibly free socially. But I think it's also important that we have more traditional, well-ordered societies that turns out actually make people happier. Religion makes people happier, conservative values make people happier, order, tradition, and predictability generally makes people happier. Now, some people won't fit. They're going to say, what are you talking about? I hate living there, and they're going to get out. But if we're going to think intelligently about how we have this big, diverse country with all these diverse religious subgroups, we've got to understand and even try to respect the moralities of those that are different from us.
Well, I'm going to push back on that a little bit, John.
Okay, good.
Because, you heard my comments on Arthur Brooks's book. We were on a panel together at the American Enterprise Institute, and about the religious question, whether conservatives within the United States, pretty clear, are happier, and religious people within the United States are happier, according to survey research. But more religious countries aren't happier.
That's
in
right.
general. So if you look at the sort of list of the happiest countries in this cross-cultural ratings, and taking into account, the handful of salt you need to take these international comparisons with, some of the most secular countries in the world are the happiest.
That's correct, but it's very dangerous.
Social democracies
it's very, very dangerous to do correlations across countries. So, for example, if you look at per capita smoking rates and you look at life expectancy, what do you think the correlation is?
I think it's low.
I don't know what the magnitude is, but the more cigarettes smoked, the longer people live. What do you make of that?
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, I don't know. Why is that?
Because rich countries smoke more. Really poor countries can't afford it. All right, now let's look at the religiosity correlates. It's true that really religious countries have lower self-reported happiness because those are especially poor countries. So there is a correlation between secularism, wealth, and happiness. You're absolutely right about that. But you have to look at within-country dynamics. It appears to be the case, although actually Arthur Brooks said there's some other surveys that show maybe Scandinavia is not really so happy. So I'm not sure about that. But
I think the right way to think about those comparisons is just take the sort of like top, fifth of the countries as a block, and just think of them as the happy countries.
That's right. Among wealthy Western countries. Yeah. That's right. That's the way to do it. Okay. And if you do that, I don't know what the correlation is. I don't know whether you see that big, clear regression line that we saw in the graphs that Arthur Brooks showed. But the way that I'm thinking about this these days is this. The United States has a lot of things going against it for happiness. That is, people thrive when they have a sense of belonging, of predictability, community. So small nations that have a long history have an enormous advantage. They know who they are. They have tradition. They have the moral resources. The United States doesn't have that. We have an enormous young country with a lot of diversity. And recent work by Robert Putnam shows that ethnic diversity appears to cause mistrust. When people are different from you, you don't invest in your community as much. Whereas when you feel like everybody around you is similar, you are more outgoing, you invest more, you're friendlier, you trust people. So what I'm saying is, the United States, I believe, starts off with conditions that are not conducive to happiness. Given that, we are way above where we ought to be. And I think it's at least possible that our religiosity increases it. So that might explain why it is that these small European countries, these more homogeneous small countries, say that they're happier. People say that they're happier on that, but I'm not doubting the data. But it may be that that's not because they're secular. It's because they have so many moral resources. They don't need religion. They have community. The book I'm writing now is called The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. And it's on how really morality comes to us courtesy of religion. That is, our evolutionary history for tribal bonding and intertribal competition is, I believe, the origin of religion and of morality in general. So it's not that you need to be religious to be moral, not at all. But the psychology of morality and the psychology of religion are indistinguishable. And if you have a tight binding community in other ways, you don't need religion. In the United States, we don't have that. We're so mobile. We're so new. We're so uninvested in our communities. We need something. I think that's why we're so religious in this country.
That's fascinating. Now, for one thing that I would say about that is I'm actually a bit skeptical of some of the sort of Putnam-esque social cohesion findings. I don't doubt that there's a negative correlation between heterogeneity and a certain level of social trust. But at the same time, the happiness literature that I've looked at actually finds a positive correlation between a certain kind of pluralistic tolerance and sort of average levels of happiness.
Is that across countries again? How does that work?
Yeah, it's just like one of the sort of questions in the World Values Survey. Yeah, it's across countries, and the questions about sort of religion and about homogeneity. So here's two things that are, playing roles in your theory. And I haven't done or had seen the full set of regression, but just eyeballing it, you see that there's just it seems kind of irrelevant. Like there doesn't seem to be a pattern that would have an explicable causal underpinning when looking at the relationship between religiosity and happiness. So you do have extremely secular countries, and maybe they do go together, so we could test it. There are extremely secular countries that are among the happiest countries in the survey. There are also extremely secular countries that are among the least happy countries because some of the least happy countries in the world
Japan.
are the post-communist countries, and those have the lowest rates of religious participation. But it doesn't seem like the religiosity is driving that result. It's the sort of the after effects of communism.
Well, that's right. That's why I think it's so hazardous to look for single factor explanations in cross-national data. I mean, I understand. I think you're right. The data is complicated, and we can't find a single principle that explains happiness. It
might be the case, though, that I would like to see whether this is true. Whether the secular countries that have high levels of happiness are also highly homogeneous.
That would be my prediction. That's right. But again, if you find a single exception, it doesn't matter because this is all about patterns underlying the many observations. So the story for any one country will be unique. So you can't say, but what about Japan? Well, that disproves your theory. So anyway.
So one of the trends that I noted when we were talking about Arthur Brooks's book is that average happiness has been increasing in Europe.
Oh, in Europe, okay.
Over the last 30 years. In most of the sort of EU countries, average happiness has been increasing as average wealth has been increasing. Now, in most of those countries, religious participation has been declining. So whatever social cohesion uptick you get from going to church, they're losing some of that. But at the same time, their happiness is going up. And then simultaneously, most of those countries, I think you would find, are actually becoming more ethnically heterogeneous. That especially with the advent of
that's right. But
EU
again, you can't do
policy.
Right, but that's why you can't do this sort of single factor sociology. I don't doubt that they're getting happier and more secular as they get richer, but you have to tease apart what causes what. For example,
but you see a pattern I'm seeing it sit uneasily. That you've got a trend towards secularization, a trend towards more happiness, a trend towards greater sort of cultural heterogeneity, and so all those things together, I think, in your theory, would predict that their happiness would be going down, not up.
Well, they're getting richer and freer, and at least at first, those really help.
So
one question is how much...
isolate whether there's a negative effect from the secularization and the heterogeneity.
Well, I think that what we need is not religion. What we need is a sense of belonging, cohesiveness, and purpose. If you are lucky enough to be in a country that is, say, Israel in its first 20 or 30 years, a country that is struggling for its existence, a country that is, or Spain coming out of Franco, if you're lucky enough to be in the period of nation building, you have a sense of purpose, you have a sense of meaning, you have a sense of nobility and community. You don't need religion. But after a while, the next generation may not have those resources. So just from Israelis I know, the older generation that was able to fight all these struggles, they seem much happier. They had a glorious life and sense of patriotism. And their children, who are our age, are sort of spoiled consumerist. They don't have the same cohesiveness. Now, Israelis are not particularly religious. They're, in fact, very unreligious. So you don't need religion. You need the social cohesion and purpose that it often gives. In America, we're a very mature democracy. We don't have this sense of common purpose. Now, a lot of Putnam's effects are driven by the fact that World War II gave that whole generation common purpose. So they were great social capitalists. They were great investors in community. And the baby boomers and people just after the baby boom, like you and me, our happiness seems to be a little less. Happiness is not going up in America. Happiness is, depression rates have been going up over the last 30 or 40 years. Happiness rates have not, even as we get richer. So
depression diagnoses are going up over the last.
That's true. A lot of it would be a diagnosis effect. But I think we'd have to look at suicide rates and some other things. Suicide rates actually began to plummet once Prozac came in, so that changes things. But at any rate, it's very difficult to do this cross-national sociology based on one trend goes one way, the other trend goes the other.
Yeah. Well, we'll have to, because this raises a great question, though. So when you have this 5 foundations view, and you have a lot of different ways that the moral sensibility can be calibrated, there's a question about the authority of any particular kind of morality. One simple takeaway from this is that it's all up in the air. It's just relativism. There's conservative moralities, there's liberal moralities. They're all moralities. On what basis are we going to? Because it doesn't seem like there's no ground outside of your own moral sensibility from which to judge other moral sensibilities. Right. So I
disagree with the last statement.
Conservative moral sensibilities here's the problem with them. They're illiberal. Right? Well, but then, of course, that begs the question about the authority of the liberal moral sensibility.
That's right. So the standard assumption in philosophical circles is either there is some moral grounding, either you're a moral realist, you think that there really is some moral truth. So religious folk often think that's God. Secular philosophers think it's reason itself, rationality. And if you can't get one of those, then you have to be a relativist because there is no moral truth at all. I take I guess you'd call it a fourth position or a different position, which is that there certainly is no external moral grounding. There's no moral truth that was true before human beings evolved and that will be true after we're all gone. There's no moral truth which is universal across the cosmos.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that everything is up to the individual, that everything is what I believe that morality reduces to taste. There's an alternate possibility. Think about emergent truths that emerge from the fact that we create society, that we live in society. So, is gold more valuable than silver, or is that just my opinion? Well, yes, it is more valuable because we have a market, and from the market emerges values. It's not my opinion. Even if most of us thought gold was less valuable, as long as the market says, as long as people are going to pay different amounts, the prices will emerge even without people knowing what those prices necessarily are. And I think moral truths are very much the same way. Is it true that men and women are equal and should have equal rights to determine their lives and to have careers or family if they want? Well, the way we live now, yes, it is. But if you go back to the times of the founding fathers, if you go back to ancient times, when to survive, you had to have division of labor. it wasn't obviously true to the Greeks that men and women were equal. And I can't say that they were wrong. Mm-hmm. They lived in a very different time. The truths of the way that they were, the kinds of societies they lived in necessitated or created certain emergent truths about interdependence of male and female. We now live in different societies, so it is no longer true. So a blind, sort of dead traditionalism says, look, women have always cared for the family, therefore they should always care for the family. If you cling to that kind of truth, then, I would say you're wrong. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean that that everyone in the world or every society in the world was wrong for 10,000 years until the 1960s.
Right. Right. Well, I think one of the ways that I like to look at it, one explanation for why there is variability, why the moral sentiments can be calibrated in different way, is that part of the design is to allow flexibility for social cooperation given different ecological conditions.
That's right.
So you want the moral sense to be a little bit labile so that social groups can adapt to different kinds of conditions. And so if you're next to a truculent warlike tribe, mm-hmm. you're going to need to amp up your in-group, out-group authority dimensions, so on and so forth. But I think but I think a way to go, and I would actually argue more for the more strongly for the authority of the distinctively liberal calibration on the grounds of what the effects of societies organized around those moral principles are. So different settings on the moral equalizer create different patterns of social cooperation, social coordination, and those patterns create different outcomes for people in terms of their happiness, their longevity, their wealth, the development of their capacities. And what I would argue is that the more liberal a society is, the better it does in terms of health, wealth, happiness, and the development of capacities. And so that there actually is something wrong with conservative morality, so that they're actually keeping people from being happier, healthier, and wealthier.
Okay, well, I would go with you entirely in what you just said, if everyone in the world was like you and me. Mm-hmm. That is, there is, and this is a major point that John Stuart Mill made. People have different life projects, different personalities, and so and that is the genius of a liberal society, is that it allows room for people to create projects, to live in ways that they find conducive. So I think I am a classic liberal in that sense, in the John Stuart Mill sense. It becomes an empirical question: what kinds of societies are best for people? And I think you're generally right that a liberal democracy, there's no other system that has emerged that creates a generally humane framework in which different people, and especially people of different ethnicities, can live together, that does it as well as a liberal democracy. So I think we pretty much all, in the debate nowadays, we pretty much all agree
there is really conflict. So Osama bin Laden is right that global liberal capitalism is going to destroy a certain kind of conservative Islamic culture.
Yes, that's correct.
He's right. And the thing is, I think that's great. I think it ought to destroy it because those people are doing less well according to sort of very fundamental. Now, you have to have a certain kind of liberal sensibility to think that those things are the things that ultimately matter.
That's right.
But I do think those are the things that ultimately matter, and so I'm committed to it.
Yeah. Again, I don't want to be a relativist and say that every morality is equally good. I agree with you that the moral system that has emerged in modern Islamic countries is terrible. It's not. It's more a matter of oppression, thuggery, dictatorship, and democracy might. Well, it's hazardous to speculate because, of course, once you allow democracy in, they tend to vote for Sharia. But what I'm arguing for is not that these systems are all equal. I think that a generally liberal democracy is the best, and that involves these settings highest on the harm and fairness foundations, lower on the in-group authority purity foundations. The case I'm trying to make, and I'm not sure I can make it in the book, but the case I'm trying to make is that you don't want to go too low on the in-group authority purity foundations. And if you leave it up to liberal political theorists, they're going to set it to zero. And that, I believe, is a mistake. So I think that, again, what we need isn't religion, it isn't patriotism necessarily. What we need is we need groups to participate in, that we respect, that we join with to pursue noble ends. And if you have a purely liberal, the extreme liberal society in which everybody is their own project of self-creation, in which all relationships are fully voluntary and everything is done on a straight utilitarian calculus, I think what you end up with is a nation of shoppers who feel empty inside.
Well,
So,
I'll leave you with the last word, other than to say that I think meaning is overrated. Thanks so much, Sean. Our time is up, and I have to actually hand off my my camera to Brink so that he can record one. So I'm gonna have to let you go. So this is fascinating. I'm a Haidtist.
And I'm a Wilkinson.
And I would love to fight you more about what the implications of your own views are.
I look forward to many more such fights.
All right. So thanks so much, John, and I'll talk to you soon.
Great. Thank you, Will.
Take care.
Bye-bye.